The office was almost dark, the kind of dark that pretends to be empty but never really is. Motion sensors hummed softly. Security lights blinked on and off as if deciding whether I deserved to be seen. My reflection followed me in the glass, fragmented, doubled, watching myself watch someone else. I thought I had mastered the art of being unnoticed. I was wrong. How long were you planning to pretend I didn't notice? The voice came from behind me, calm, even, not raised. That was the worst part. My body reacted before my mind did. Heat rushing to my face, pulse climbing my throat, hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. I didn't turn around right away. I couldn't. Turning would make it real. Turning would mean I had been caught doing something I'd spent weeks convincing myself wasn't wrong. Silence stretched between us, heavy and deliberate. I waited for anger, for accusation, for the sharp edge of embarrassment to be handed back to me in words I could defend against. Instead, there was only disappointment, measured, controlled, like someone looking at a result they hadn't hoped for, but had prepared for. I finally faced him. The overhead lights cast lines across his face, clean and unforgiving. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't rushed. He looked settled, like this moment belonged to him, not me, like I was the one intruding. I, my voice failed me. There's a particular kind of shame that doesn't need explanation. It blooms internally, quiet and corrosive, because you recognize yourself in it before anyone else has to say a word. I didn't feel judged. I felt assessed. Around us, the office watched. Glass walls reflected our bodies back at us from different angles. Screens dimmed but didn't go black. Somewhere above us, cameras blinked red, indifferent. I became painfully aware of how visible I was, how visible I had always been. The lie I'd been telling myself cracked open all at once, that I was careful, that I was discreet, that noticing someone too closely wasn't the same as crossing a line. He didn't step closer. He didn't step away. He just waited. That restraint landed harder than confrontation ever could. It forced me to sit inside my own intention without the comfort of being interrupted. I realized then that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just stands still and lets you unravel. In that moment, everything tilted. The roles I thought we were playing, observer and observed, collapsed into something far less flattering. I wasn't exposed because I'd been careless. I was exposed because I'd assumed my feelings gave me cover, because I'd mistaken silence for consent, because I'd convinced myself that watching wasn't the same as wanting something I wasn't willing to ask for. What terrified me wasn't that he knew. It was the look on his face, like I had just failed a test I didn't know I was taking. If you've ever told yourself a small lie because it felt safer than the truth, stay with me and be honest. Have you ever crossed a quiet line and hoped no one would notice? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes admitting it is the first time we stop pretending. The office liked to pretend it was neutral. Beige walls, soft lighting, open plans meant to signal transparency. But beneath that design was a hierarchy everyone understood without being taught. You didn't need titles posted on doors to know who mattered. You felt it in how conversations stopped when certain people walked by, in how laughter softened, in how shoulders tightened. This place worshipped metrics. Dashboards glowed like altars, performance charts, productivity curves, quiet judgments rendered in numbers no one argued with. You weren't evaluated on effort or intention, only outcomes, only usefulness. And usefulness here was temporary. People didn't fear failure. Failure was measurable. You could explain it. People feared attention. Attention meant you'd been noticed for something that didn't fit neatly into a cell on a spreadsheet. Attention meant questions. Questions meant vulnerability. And vulnerability, in a system like this, was treated like a defect. The rules weren't written down. but everyone followed them. Don't linger too long. Don't ask why. Don't stand out unless you're certain it will benefit someone above you. Security badges clicked softly at every entrance. Logging movement. Access levels decided where you could go, what you could see, how late you could stay. It all felt efficient, professional, necessary, until you realized how easily it could be used to trace a person's habits instead of their work. There was one man in management everyone adjusted themselves around. He never raised his voice, never needed to. Meetings changed shape when he spoke. People nodded before he finished his sentences. His power wasn't loud, it was anticipatory. Decisions seemed to make themselves in his favor before he even asked. He didn't threaten, he implied. An implication traveled faster than orders ever could. I had watched coworkers compromise themselves in small ways, laughing at jokes they didn't find funny, staying quiet when something felt off, trading pieces of their dignity for stability, telling themselves it was temporary. That's how the system worked. It didn't force you. It let you choose over and over again until the choice stopped feeling like one. After that night, after being seen in a way I couldn't undo, the office felt different. The glass didn't just reflect light anymore. It reflected behavior, movement, proximity. I started noticing how often people checked over their shoulders before speaking, how quickly private tabs closed when footsteps passed, how silence could be a form of self-preservation. It dawned on me slowly, then all at once. This place didn't just track productivity, it tracked people. And if you've ever felt that quiet pressure to shrink yourself just to stay safe, you already know how easy it is to justify things you'd never defend out loud. Stay with me. He was easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. Not because he blended in, but because he never asked to be seen. He sat slightly apart in meetings, not withdrawn, just precise about his space. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, people leaned in without realizing they were doing it. There was nothing performative about him, no sharp elbows, no forced confidence. He didn't compete for attention. He let it pass him by. I learned his name the way you learn most quiet things, by overhearing it, by seeing it typed in clean, careful lines on shared documents, by noticing how people addressed him when they needed something done right the first time. Rowan. Just Rowan. No nickname. No shortcuts. He avoided the rituals that passed for bonding. Happy hours. Loud lunches. Group jokes that leaned too close to cruelty and called it humor. When conversations drifted into territory that felt careless, he found reasons to step away. Not dramatic exits, just small disappearances. He returned to his desk, his screen, his work, as if visibility were a cost he measured carefully. What drew me to him wasn't desire. It was admiration shaped like restraint. The way he held himself felt intentional, like someone who understood the weight of being misread and chose precision over defense. He never reacted to power, never flinched when senior voices filled the room. He acknowledged authority without feeding it. I started noticing how much he noticed, details others skipped over. A typo buried 3 tabs deep, a pattern in data that didn't quite make sense yet. The shift in tone when someone crossed a line and pretended they hadn't. He filed these things away quietly, like they might matter later. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, not lingering, not curious in the way people usually are. It felt more like recognition, as if he'd placed me somewhere in his internal map of the office. That unsettled me more than indifference would have. Being unseen had felt safe. Being seen by him felt deliberate. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was projecting, that mutual awareness didn't equal connection. But awareness has weight. It sits between people even when unspoken. It changes how you move, how you breathe, how careful you are with your own intentions. I thought I was invisible to him. I wasn't. And if you've ever realized too late that someone understood you better than you understood yourself, you know how quietly that realization can rearrange everything. It started with a moment that felt too small to matter. He stood up from his desk to get coffee, phone buzzing in his pocket, jacket draped over his chair. He didn't rush. He never rushed. And when he walked away, his screen stayed on. I didn't mean to look. That's the lie people tell themselves when they already know they're going to. My eyes moved before my conscience could catch up. A paused video sat open on his monitor. Two men in a narrow kitchen, laughing softly, shoulders brushing as they passed each other. Nothing graphic. Nothing secret, really. Just intimacy in its most unguarded form. The kind that exists when someone forgets they might be watched. Something tightened in my chest. Not disgust, not surprise. Something closer to grief. I felt like I'd stumbled into a room I hadn't been invited into and realized, too late, that the door hadn't been locked because trust had been assumed. I looked away, immediately. My heart raced as if I'd been caught in the act, even though no one was there. I told myself it was accidental, that it didn't count, that seeing wasn't the same as stealing, that knowing something about someone didn't mean I'd taken it from them. But after that, my attention changed shape. I started noticing patterns, the way his playlists shifted depending on who was nearby, how he adjusted his posture when certain coworkers lingered too long, the half-second pause before he laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I told myself I was being observant, empathetic, supportive even. The truth was harder to admit. I was collecting fragments without permission. I watched reflections in glass instead of looking directly. I learned his routines without asking. I noticed when he stayed later than usual, when he left early without explanation. Each observation came with a justification attached: concern, curiosity, care, fear, fear of asking the wrong question, fear of hearing the wrong answer, fear of losing something I'd never had the right to claim. Power crept into it quietly, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that knows. Knowing creates leverage, even when you don't intend to use it, especially when you don't intend to use it. Every time I noticed something new, the guilt followed close behind, and every time I soothed it with the same excuse. I wasn't hurting anyone. I wasn't interfering. I was just paying attention. That's how lines disappear, not in leaps, in inches. I became aware of how often he was alone, how carefully he navigated shared spaces, how much effort it took to remain neutral in a place that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. My watching shifted from interest to vigilance, from attraction to anticipation. I started bracing myself for something to go wrong, as if my awareness could prevent it. It didn't. What it did was make me complicit. I stopped interrupting the moment. I stopped turning away. I let myself see more than I should have because seeing made me feel prepared. Prepared for what? I couldn't say. All I knew was that looking away now felt like abandonment. I told myself it didn't change how I felt about him, but I stopped looking away. And if you've ever crossed a line because turning back felt harder than going forward, ask yourself this: at what point did curiosity become entitlement? Let me know in the comments. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward stopping. He didn't announce himself the way powerful people usually do. No heavy footsteps, no raised voice, just a presence that rearranged the air when he stepped into it. He smiled easily, the kind of smile that made people feel chosen when it landed on them. Senior enough that his time felt valuable, casual enough that you forgot he was watching. I was waiting for the elevator when he came up beside me, close enough that his reflection merged with mine in the mirrored wall. He didn't look at me right away. He checked his phone, sighed like we were sharing a private inconvenience, then spoke as if continuing a conversation we'd already started. You know, he said lightly, most people don't realize how much they give away just by where they stand. My stomach dropped. I kept my eyes forward. Silence had become a reflex by then. He finally turned to me, still smiling. You've been spending a lot of time on that floor, he added. Late nights. The elevator dinged somewhere above us, too far away. I noticed patterns, he continued, unbothered. Occupational hazard. Then, like an afterthought, you're not subtle. I felt heat crawl up my neck. There it was. Not an accusation, a confirmation. He knew, and he wanted me to know that he knew. Before I could speak, he tilted his phone just enough for me to see the screen. A still image. Grainy. Taken from an angle I recognized only because I'd started recognizing angles. Security footage. Me, half turned, watching. I wouldn't worry, he said softly. This isn't official. Yet. The word yet did all the work. He explained it like a favor. There had been a concern, he said, an informal note. Someone had mentioned inappropriate attention. HR liked to keep records. Nothing actionable. Not unless it became a pattern. Not unless someone helped it along. What I'm saying, he continued, voice still warm, is that situations like this have a way of escalating, unless everyone involved is cooperative. Cooperative. The word landed with weight. He wasn't asking for anything specific. That was the brilliance of it. He didn't have to. The implication was enough. Stay quiet. Share what you see. Don't interfere when certain projects start going sideways. Don't ask questions when people with softer edges make mistakes they're not allowed to recover from. His gaze sharpened just for a second. Some people don't understand how fragile their position is, he said. I try to protect them from themselves. Protect. Another lie dressed as virtue. I realized then that this wasn't about me being caught. It wasn't even about him. It was about control, about who got to define what crossed a line and who got to survive it. The office hadn't just been watching us. He had been. From above, from behind glass, from angles we never consented to. He smiled again, satisfied, and stepped into the elevator when it arrived. Before the doors closed, he glanced back at me. You're not the only one who's been watching, he said. The doors slid shut, leaving me alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the sudden, brutal clarity settling in my chest. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about survival. If you've ever realized too late that staying silent was a choice someone else was counting on you to make, pause here. Comment below. Have you ever taken someone for granted? What happened when you realized it? Because once you see how power really works, you can't unsee it. And the next choice you make matters more than you think. He didn't give me time to decide what kind of person I was going to be. It happened before I could reach out to anyone, before fear settled into strategy. He waited until the floor emptied, until the office slipped back into its late-night hush. Then he approached my desk, not cautiously, not aggressively, with the same measured calm I'd come to recognize as his default. We need to talk, he said. There was no accusation in his voice, no tension, just certainty. That somehow made it worse. I followed him into one of the glass-walled conference rooms, the kind meant for collaboration, but often used for quiet, uncomfortable conversations no one wanted overheard. He closed the door but didn't sit right away. He leaned against the table, arms folded loosely, eyes steady. I know, he said, before I could speak. I've known for a while. My chest tightened. I felt exposed all over again. But this time there was nowhere to hide behind confusion or misunderstanding. The truth was already on the table, laid out neatly, waiting for me to catch up. I saw you watching me, he continued, not just once. I braced for anger, for disgust, for the kind of disappointment that hardens into distance. Instead, he looked tired, not wounded, evaluative, like someone reviewing evidence they'd hoped they wouldn't need. Before I could apologize, before I could explain myself into something smaller and more forgivable, he spoke again. He's been watching too. That stopped me. Longer than you, he added, and louder. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the quiet man in front of me with the implications of what he was saying. He reached into his bag and pulled out a slim folder. Not dramatic, not rushed. He placed it on the table between us and slid it forward. Inside were printouts, emails, access logs, timestamps, patterns I hadn't known how to name but recognized instantly once I saw them laid out. Late night badge activity that didn't align with project needs, security footage accessed without authorization, messages framed as concern that read differently when stacked together. I started documenting months ago, he said. Not because I wanted to, because I needed to. I swallowed. You knew, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. About him. About you. The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. He met my gaze without flinching. I didn't stop you, he said quietly. Not because I approved, because I needed to see what you'd do with proximity. The room felt smaller, the glass walls pressed in. I realized then that I had never been in control of the narrative I thought I was quietly shaping. I had been observed, weighed, and, this part hurt the most, given time. I needed to know, he continued, who would choose fear and who would choose truth. The shame that rose in me was different from before. It wasn't about being caught. It was about being seen clearly and still having to decide what kind of person I was going to be next. He gathered the papers back into the folder, movements unhurried. I'm filing a formal report, he said. HR, legal, everything. Then, after a pause, I wanted you to hear it from me first. There it was. Not a demand, not a threat, an invitation, with consequences either way. I realized then how wrong I'd been about him. He wasn't fragile. He wasn't passive. He was patient, strategic. He had understood the system long before it turned its attention on him. He'd just refused to let it decide the outcome alone. As he stood to leave, he stopped at the door and looked back at me once more. Whatever you choose, he said, make sure it's something you can live with when no one's watching. And if you've ever discovered that the person you underestimated was the one holding the truth the entire time, sit with that feeling. Because moments like this don't come twice, and the cost of choosing wrong lasts longer than the fear of choosing right. The process began quietly, and then swallowed everything. HR called it an internal review. Legal called it due diligence. What it felt like was being slowly taken apart by people who spoke in neutral tones and never said the words that mattered. I repeated the same facts in different rooms, under different lights, to different faces that gave nothing back. Dates, times, who stood where, what I saw, what I didn't say, what I should have said sooner. Every sentence felt like a confession, even when it wasn't. The preemptive concern he'd hinted at resurfaced almost immediately, framed as caution, as care, as someone raising a flag early. That tactic might have worked if the evidence hadn't already been waiting. His move didn't bury the truth. It cracked it open. Access logs contradicted timelines. Screenshots raised questions about permissions that shouldn't have existed. Suddenly, the scrutiny he'd relied on turned inward. That didn't stop the fallout. People stopped sitting near me. Conversations ended when I walked into rooms. Invitations disappeared. Someone I'd considered a friend asked, carefully, whether I was sure this was the hill I wanted to die on. I learned how fast reputations shift when discomfort needs somewhere to land. Silence became contagious. Self preservation always is. He paid for it too, in ways no one announced. Projects reassigned without explanation. Meetings he used to be in removed from his calendar. Praise redirected. Momentum slowed to a crawl. Nothing overt enough to contest, just enough to remind him and me that truth carries a price the system never reimburses. There were nights I sat alone in my apartment, replaying every decision that had led me here, wondering when curiosity turned into harm, when fear turned into complicity, when speaking up became something I delayed long enough for damage to spread. The guilt wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, persistent, the kind that settles in and waits. I thought about how easy it would have been to stay quiet, to let someone else carry the weight, to convince myself that survival justified silence. Some nights, that temptation felt merciful. There were moments I watched him across the office, still composed, still precise, and wondered if I'd cost him more than I could ever make right. We didn't talk much then, not out of distance, but restraint. We were both conserving energy, choosing carefully what to spend it on. Trust was no longer abstract. It was something rebuilt in fragments. The waiting was the worst part. Weeks passed without updates. Rumors filled the gaps where facts refused to go. Each email notification tightened my chest. Each meeting request felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. I learned something during that time that no policy manual ever teaches. Doing the right thing doesn't feel righteous while you're doing it. It feels lonely. It feels inconvenient. It feels like you're losing pieces of a life you worked hard to build, with no guarantee they'll be returned. There were nights I wondered if silence would have hurt less. If you've ever stood in that space, between what's easy and what's right, you already know there's no clean way through it. Stay with me. The cost doesn't end here.